There is a specific kind of contempt that institutions practice without knowing they practice it. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with hostile intent. It arrives in the form of assignment in the decision, made without malice and without much thought, to give the least prestigious work to the least prestigious person and to consider the matter settled. The Volkai Naval Academy's senior staff made this decision on the morning of Cadet Enrollment Day, year 6204 of the Fleet Reckoning, when they assigned the Academy's first and only human cadet to the ship maintenance rotation and returned to their other work. They did not think about the decision again. There was no reason to. It was a small decision about a small matter. The human was new. The ship needed cleaning. The logic was clean. What the logic did not account for was what the human would do while cleaning the ship. Cadet Obi Achebe-Nakamura had arrived at the Volkai Naval Academy through a process that the Academy's enrollment committee had found, reviewing his application, genuinely unprecedented. The Academy was the premier naval training institution of the Volkai hegemony, a seven-system civilization whose naval doctrine was considered, by most serious military analysts in the known region, the most sophisticated in operation. It admitted cadets from the hegemony's member worlds through a competitive examination process, and it admitted, on a quota basis, a small number of cadets from allied and associate civilizations, whose militaries the hegemony wished to build relationships with. Humanity was an associate civilization. The quota was 2 cadets per enrollment cycle. In year 6204, the Terran Assembly had submitted 1 application. The enrollment committee reviewed Obi Achebe-Nakamura's file with the thorough, slightly detached efficiency of people who process large quantities of applications and have learned to locate the relevant information quickly. His academic record was excellent. His physical assessments were within acceptable parameters for a human, which the committee's rubric noted as a separate category from Volkai parameters, since the 2 species' physiology differed enough that a common scale was not meaningful. His letters of recommendation from the Terran Assembly's Naval Preparatory Program were strong. The committee admitted him without significant debate. The quota existed to be filled. The file was acceptable. He was in. What the committee had not done, not because they were negligent but because their framework did not prompt them to, was ask what he wanted to do with the training. They had assessed whether he qualified. They had not asked what he was qualified for. These are different questions, and the gap between them is where this entire account lies. The Volkai Naval Academy's curriculum was built on a philosophy that its founders had articulated in year 5801, and that every subsequent generation of administrators had affirmed. An officer must understand the ship before the ship will trust the officer. This was not mysticism. It was engineering logic dressed in the language of tradition. The idea was that command-level decision-making in naval combat required an intuitive understanding of a vessel's capabilities and limitations that could not be acquired from manuals alone. That the officer who had spent time in the engineering sections, the maintenance corridors, the power distribution nodes, and the hull inspection crawlways had a different and more reliable understanding of what their ship could and could not do than the officer who had learned the same information from a datapad in a classroom. The Academy required all cadets in their first year to rotate through a full maintenance cycle on one of the Academy's training vessels. Every cadet cleaned, repaired, and physically inspected every accessible section of their assigned ship. This was not considered prestigious work. It was considered foundational work, necessary, universal, and something to move past. The senior cadets who supervised the first-year maintenance rotations treated the assignment with the brisk efficiency of people performing a ritual they understand the purpose of but do not find interesting. The assignment was made, the rotation was scheduled, and the cadets did the work. For Volkai cadets who had grown up in a culture saturated with naval tradition and who arrived at the Academy with a working conceptual understanding of Volkai ship architecture already in place, the maintenance rotation confirmed and deepened what they already knew. It was, for them, context filling in around existing structure. For Obi Achebe-Nakamura, who had grown up in the Terran Assembly's naval preparatory system, and who had studied Volkai naval doctrine extensively in preparation for his application, but had never been aboard a Volkai vessel before the day he arrived at the academy, the maintenance rotation was something different. It was everything. It was the first time he had direct physical access to the systems he had studied from the outside, and he approached it with the particular attention of someone who understands that they are seeing something they cannot afford to miss. The senior cadet assigned to oversee his rotation was a fourth year named Varathan Dul, who had been given the human as a supervisory assignment by the rotation coordinator with the implicit understanding that the assignment was not demanding. The human would need more guidance than a Volkai first year because he lacked the cultural background. He would probably be slower. He would need explanations that a Volkai cadet would not need. Varathan Dul had other work. He briefed the human on the rotation schedule, showed him the maintenance checklist, demonstrated the correct operation of the cleaning and inspection equipment, and left him to it. He checked in at the intervals the protocol required. The human was always where he was supposed to be, doing what he was supposed to be doing. The checkboxes were filled. The rotation proceeded. What Varathan Dul did not observe, because he was not present for the hours between check-ins, was what the human was doing in addition to what he was supposed to be doing. The maintenance checklist specified what to clean and how to clean it. It did not specify that a cadet should, while cleaning the coolant distribution manifold in Section 14, spend 40 minutes tracing the manifolds routing through the adjacent bulkhead and making notes about where it interfaced with the power relay assembly 3 meters away. It did not specify that a cadet should, while inspecting the hull plating in the lower aft section, press his palm flat against each panel and note which ones transmitted vibration differently than their neighbors and at what frequency. It did not specify that a cadet should, while performing the standard sanitation cycle on the crew deck corridors, walk each corridor 3 times, once performing the task, once observing the overhead conduit routing, once counting the steps between each access panel and the nearest emergency systems node. The checklist did not specify these things, because the checklist was designed for cadets who already had a framework and were filling it in. It was not designed for a cadet who was building the framework from scratch, using his hands and his feet, and 40 minutes of undisturbed attention at each station, because he had understood from the first day that this was the only time he would have direct access to the ship's physical reality before the Academy's curriculum moved him into classrooms and simulations, and he intended to use it. He kept notes. This was not prohibited. The Academy's maintenance rotation guidelines did not address the question of cadets keeping personal notes because no previous cadet had found it necessary to address. The notes were not elaborate. They were precise. By the end of the rotation's 3rd week, he had filled 2 standard-issue personal data tablets with observations organized by ship section, what each system looked like from the inside, how it connected to adjacent systems, where the connection points were physically located, what the physical indicators of normal operation were, and this part required inference from his preparatory study, combined with what he was seeing, what deviation from those indicators would suggest. Not failure, deviation. The early signals that something was moving toward failure before it arrived there. His assigned ship was the Academy training vessel VNS Perseverance, a mid-weight patrol cruiser that had been in the Academy's training fleet for 22 years, and that the Academy's maintenance staff knew with the intimacy of long familiarity. By the end of his 8-week rotation, Obi Achebe-Nakamura knew her differently, not with the deep contextual knowledge of the maintenance staff, who understood her history and her quirks and the repairs she had accumulated over 2 decades, but with the specific knowledge of someone who had touched every accessible surface and traced every accessible system and built, from physical observation and inference and careful notation, a map of how she worked, and where the map had gaps. He identified 9 things during the rotation that he flagged in his notes as requiring further investigation. Not problems. He was careful about this distinction, and his notes reflect the care. Things that did not match his expectation based on what the technical specifications said the system should look like or feel like or sound like. Deviations from the expected that might be within normal operational variation, or might not be. He did not know which. He did not have sufficient knowledge to know which. He noted them and moved on. He raised one of them with Verathon Duel at their final check-in of the rotation. He described what he had observed in Section 7's power rel. I coupling, a faint but consistent harmonic in the conduit that he could feel through the hull plating adjacent to it, present at a frequency that his notes indicated was not present in Section 6's identical coupling 6 meters away, and which was not mentioned in the technical specifications as a normal operational characteristic. He asked if this was expected. Verathon Duel listened to the description. He said he would look into it. He filed a maintenance query with the ship's technical staff because the protocol required him to follow up on anything a cadet flagged, and the protocol was the protocol. The technical staff reviewed the query, ran a diagnostic, and found a developing microfracture in the coupling's internal resonance dampener, a fault that was within acceptable operational parameters for current operations, but would have propagated to system failure within 6 to 8 months of continued use. They replaced the dampener. The fault was resolved. The maintenance record was updated. The technical staff's report noted the source of the query as first-year cadet observation during maintenance rotation. The report was filed. The rotation coordinator, processing the paperwork, noted with mild surprise that a first year had flagged a developing fault that the standard diagnostic cycle had not yet caught, and filed that observation in the rotation coordinator's own notes, where it sat alongside similar observations about other cadets and other cycles, and was not acted upon further because it was one data point, and data points require accumulation before they become patterns. Obi Achebe-Nakamura completed the maintenance rotation and moved into the Academy's second phase curriculum. Classroom instruction in naval doctrine, fleet tactical theory, command decision frameworks, and the other subjects that the Academy considered the core of an officer's education. He was, by the accounts of his instructors from this period, a competent student, attentive, thorough, occasionally asking questions that the instructors found oddly specific. Not advanced questions, not challenging questions, but questions about physical detail. Where exactly in the ship's architecture did this system interface with that one? What did the specified operational parameter look like from inside the maintenance corridor rather than on a monitoring display? What physical indicators would an officer on the bridge see, or feel, or hear, if this system was performing at the lower end of its specified range rather than the upper? The instructors answered the questions. They were not difficult questions to answer. They were questions that, in retrospect, formed a very clear picture of what the cadet was building. But the instructors were not assembling the picture across sessions, because each instructor saw their own subject and their own questions, and no one was looking at the whole. No one was looking at the whole because the Academy's administrative framework did not prompt anyone to look at the whole for a first-year cadet in the associate civilization quota. He was proceeding satisfactorily. He was meeting requirements. The framework was satisfied. The examination that changed everything came at the end of year 6204's second term, the fleet tactical simulation that all first-year cadets took as their mid-program assessment. The simulation was a standard defensive scenario, a mixed fleet, 3 vessels, responding to an attack by a superior force in an environment with specific navigational constraints. The cadet's role was tactical advisor to the simulated fleet commander, not the commander, not yet, but the officer providing analysis and recommendations that the commander would act on. The simulation was designed to test tactical knowledge, situational assessment, and the ability to communicate recommendations clearly under pressure. Obi Achebe-Nakamura was assigned to the simulation team for VNS Perseverance, his maintenance rotation ship, now fully crewed for simulation purposes by cadets and overseen by Academy staff playing the roles of command crew. The assignment was routine. Cadets were generally assigned to their rotation vessel for the first simulation, on the theory that familiarity with the ship's characteristics was an asset in tactical advising. For most cadets, this familiarity was the generalized familiarity of their rotation training. For this cadet, it was 8 weeks of physical notation and 9 flagged observations, and 2 data tablets of system-specific detail organized by section. The simulation ran for 4 hours. The reviewing staff's assessment report, filed the following day, is a document that the Academy's curriculum committee has since used as a case study in every subsequent training review, and which this account will describe only in its essentials. The tactical recommendations that the cadet provided during the simulation were not, in the reviewing staff's assessment, brilliant. They were not the product of superior tactical intuition or advanced strategic insight. They were something the reviewing staff found, initially, harder to categorize. They were specific, specifically specific. When the simulation's attacking force targeted VNS Perseverance's starboard maneuvering system, the cadet's recommendation accounted not just for the general operational impact of damage to that system, which any cadet with classroom training could have provided, but for the specific consequence of damage to that system, given that the starboard maneuvering coupling on VNS Perseverance sat 3 meters from the power relay assembly in Section 14, and that an impact sufficient to damage the maneuvering coupling would, with high probability, also affect the relay assembly, which would cascade to the secondary lighting system on Deck 3, which would trigger the automated emergency protocol that rerouted power from the Deck 3 systems to the bridge backup array, which would momentarily reduce bridge sensor resolution by approximately 12%. 12%. He had a number, not an estimate, a number derived from the specific architecture of the specific ship he had spent 8 weeks cleaning, traced from the physical configuration he had mapped in a data tablet that he had spent the previous 6 months reviewing and updating with information from his classroom sessions. The reviewing staff checked his number against the ship's actual technical specifications. It was within 2% of the documented figure. The simulation's attacking force, in the scenario design, had a tactical window of approximately 90 seconds at the moment of the cascade event, a window during which the reduced sensor resolution made Perseverance vulnerable to a specific flanking maneuver. The scenario designers had included this window as a test element. Cadets who identified it would recommend a compensating action. Cadets who did not would miss it, and the scenario's outcome would reflect the miss. Obi Achebe-Nakamura identified the window 14 seconds before it opened, recommended a preemptive repositioning that closed it before the simulated attacker could exploit it, and explained his reasoning in precise physical terms that the simulation's fleet commander, a third-year cadet playing the role, later said, in the debrief, had been the clearest tactical rationale she had heard in 2 years of simulation training. The reviewing staff filed their assessment. The assessment noted the specificity of the cadets' recommendations and their derivation from what appeared to be unusually detailed knowledge of the assigned vessel's physical architecture. It recommended a review of the cadets' training record to understand the source of this knowledge. The review was conducted. The source was identified: the maintenance rotation. The rotation coordinators filed observation. The note about the first year who had flagged a developing fault during cleaning was retrieved and read alongside the simulation assessment. The curriculum committee was convened. The curriculum committee's meeting was 3 hours long. Its conclusion, documented in a report that the Academy's commandant reviewed and approved the following week, was this: the maintenance rotation was producing different outcomes for different cadets, and the Academy had not been measuring the difference. Volkai cadets arrived with a framework and the rotation deepened it. The human cadet had arrived without a framework and the rotation had been, for him, the framework itself. And because the framework had been built entirely from physical observation rather than inherited cultural understanding, it was more granular, more specific, and more precisely mapped to the actual vessel than what most Volkai cadets carried out of the same rotation. Not better, the committee was careful to note. Different. A different kind of knowledge, produced by a different starting condition, that turned out to have significant tactical value in precisely the situations where specific ship knowledge mattered most. The committee recommended 3 changes to the Academy's curriculum. The first was that the Maintenance Rotations Assessment Framework be revised to capture and evaluate what cadets were observing during the rotation, not just whether they had completed the checklist. The second was that personal notation during the rotation be formally encouraged rather than simply not prohibited. The third was that Cadet Achebe-Nakamura's simulation results be flagged as the basis for a new performance category in the tactical assessment rubric, one that the existing rubric had no name for because it had no history of measuring it. The category's working title, used in the committee's internal documents, was Vessel Intimate Knowledge. The name was replaced, in the final curriculum revision, with something more formally appropriate, but the Academy's cadets, in years that followed, called it by the working title, and the working title persisted because it was accurate. The remaining 3 years of Obi Achebe-Nakamura's time at the Academy were not the subject of administrative scrutiny in the way his first year had been. He proceeded through the curriculum, met requirements, and produced a record that his instructors assessed as strong without being exceptional, strong tactical analysis, strong systems knowledge, adequate command theory, adequate fleet doctrine. He graduated in the middle third of his class. At the graduation ceremony, the Academy's commandant shook his hand and said something that the Academy's formal record preserves because the commandant's remarks at graduation were always recorded. The commandant said, "You taught us something. That is not a common thing for a student to do. We are grateful." He returned to the Terran Assembly's naval service with a Volkai Naval Academy graduation certificate, a letter of commendation from the curriculum committee, and the 2 data tablets of notes he had made during the maintenance rotation, updated by the time he left, with 4 years of additional information from his classroom instruction, his simulation training, and 3 practical deployment exercises aboard Academy vessels. The tablets had been his from the first day. No one had ever asked to see them, no one had thought to. He served for 28 more years. His career in the Terran Assembly's naval service produced a record that subsequent analysts found consistent in one specific way. In every command position he held, his decisions in high-stress tactical situations showed an unusual specificity about the physical capabilities and limitations of his own vessels. Not the general parameters that any trained officer would know, but the granular, section-level, system-specific detail that reflected a habit of attention he had developed in the maintenance corridors of VNS Perseverance and never stopped practicing. Every ship he commanded, he cleaned. Not personally, not in the literal sense, he had crews for that, but he walked every accessible section in the first weeks of each command with a data tablet, and he noted what he found, and he updated the notes as he learned more, and the notes were always there when the situation required them. His officers called this the walk. It became, in the units he commanded, something between a practice and a tradition not required, not formally encouraged, but observed and gradually adopted by the officers who served under him and noticed what it produced. The walk spread in the way that useful habits spread through the people who had seen it work. Several of those people went on to command positions of their own. The walk went with them. The Volkai Naval Academy revised its maintenance rotation curriculum twice in the decade after Obi Achebe-Nakamura's graduation, and twice more in the decade after that. The Vessel Intimate Knowledge category became a permanent part of the tactical assessment rubric. The notation practice became a formal component of the rotation training. The developing fault that a first-year cadet had identified in Section 7's power relay coupling, the fault that would have propagated to failure in 6 to 8 months, was documented in the training fleet's maintenance records as the first instance of what the Academy's updated curriculum, now called observational diagnostic, the identification of developing system issues through physical attention rather than formal diagnostic protocol. There have been 47 subsequent instances documented in the training fleet's records. 41 of them were identified by first-year cadets on maintenance rotation. The fundamental misunderstanding of this account is one that every institution that assigns work by prestige rather than purpose eventually commits. The Volkai Naval Academy did not assign the human cadet to the maintenance rotation as punishment. It assigned him because the rotation needed to be filled, and he was new and new cadets did the maintenance rotation. The logic was sound, and the outcome was not what the logic predicted, because the logic was reasoning about a Volkai cadet, and it was dealing with a human one. And the difference between those two things, in starting conditions, in what the same experience produces, in what attention looks like when it is not filling in a familiar framework, but building an unfamiliar one from scratch, was a difference the logic had no reason to have accounted for and therefore had not. The prestige of an assignment determines who is sent to do it. It does not determine what they find there. An institution that assigns its lowest prestige work to its least regarded people and stops thinking about it after the assignment is made has, in effect, decided that the lowest prestige work contains nothing worth finding. This is sometimes correct. It is never safe to assume. A cadet who is given the oldest assignment and the least supervision and the most unremarkable work on the ship is a cadet who has been given access to the ship. What they do with that access is not determined by the assignment. It is determined by the cadet. The Volkai Naval Academy learned this in year 6204. The curriculum it built from the lesson has been teaching it to cadets ever since. The last public statement Obi Achebe-Nakamura made on the occasion of his retirement from the Terran Assembly's naval service was brief. He thanked his crews. He thanked the Volkai Naval Academy, specifically its curriculum committee. He thanked the Academy's maintenance staff for VNS perseverance, who had answered his questions during the rotation without complaint and had taught him more than they had probably intended to. And then he said, to the assembled officers and officials and family members present, one thing that the records have preserved and that this account will end with, because it contains everything that needs to be said and says it in the only way it needs to be said. He said, whatever they give you to do, do it completely. You are always learning something. The question is whether you are paying attention. If this story gave you something, if it made you think differently about what it means to pay attention, hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another story like this one.